Hi, I'm Rob King. Welcome to the retrospective on the Ordinary Bitter. This has absolutely been extraordinary. Coming back to that in a minute. In today's episode, we are going to re-evaluate that Ordinary Bitter. We'll look at all of the vital statistics. We are going to have a look at the fermentation profile and schedule that we applied, and starting to look at the costs and my all-important price per pint, and then ranking compared to all the other homebrews from this year, finishing off, of course, with the lessons learned. Starting then on that re-evaluation. Now, first up, we have lost some of the clarity in this pour. This was wonderfully clear in the previous ones, but I think the carbonation frizzed it all up when we opened the bottle. However, it still has a wonderful just off white head. Aroma too. Very, very nice indeed. Has lots of those malty overtones and a little bit of sweetness to it. But it definitely is in the clarity that we have gone completely wrong. That is such a shame. However, let's go in for the most important, that mouthfeel and the taste. This is still one of my favourite homebrews from this year. I could just quaff this down. Isn't it just the most typical thing possible that the smallest batch I did of the year is probably one of the best? Darned it. Overall then, 6 weeks later, this is still a winner chicken dinner. Moving on to the vital statistics. Now, first up and most obvious is that 96% brewhouse efficiency. I do not believe a word of that. And I think I now have a working hypothesis as to what happened. I think because the sample I'm taking is from within the grain bed itself, I am picking up a much more sugar-rich sample than is representative of the whole thing. That explains this and many other question marks over recent homebrews. That certainly is now my working theory, and I'm going to see if I can prove that next time. pH was perfectly in range, so there were no lactic acid additions. However, that OG did come up in very high, and that is responsible for the higher than anticipated ABV. Not that I'm complaining on that front, it's still pretty smooth. Final gravity, of course, came out spot on. Good result there. Now, when it comes to the yeast starter, we added an additional 1 litre of liquid, and while that hasn't particularly had a great deal of effect on the result, I expected it to have more of an effect. It was an additional litre, but my fermenter volume still come in just about 10 litres, so maybe I was a bit short without that addition. As I've mentioned already, I was then disappointed with only 6 litres in the bottle, and I am down to my final few. Overall though, carbonation, colour, despite my problem with clarity on this particular bottle, all came out wonderfully. Let's move on to the profile. Now, this was a really simple fermentation profile. 14 days in primary, 14 days in carbonation, and then a little bit of time in conditioning. Easy peasy. And in reality, it all went even quicker. When you look at the schedule, it really did only spend 7 days in primary because we'd reached that final gravity. Actually, that was the advantage of using the ice spindle, but I do wonder whether just a little bit of extra time in primary would have still been beneficial. You know, can't argue with the result though. By day 7, we were on to bottling. By day 21, we were putting it in the fridge, and we were good to go. I brewed this on the 28th of June. Today is the 29th of August, 2 months later, and we are down to our final couple of bottles. My favourite bit, costs. Let's start with that wonderful breakdown. 48% of the cost was the grains. Now, not that these were particularly expensive, £8.24 in total. That was the biggest single cost for the whole batch. Next up, it is water at 24%. Now, again, I've mentioned this before, I use bottled water. This is a personal choice. Hops then were 20%, the wonderful EKG, and that left us with zero cost for yeast, because this was my first example of reusing yeast. And then the final 8% made up all those final additions. This was £1.34 for the Fermado, for the Wolflock tablet, for the priming sugar for carbonation, for the water chemistry that we added at the start. So the overall cost of this small batch was £17.14. But what is the price per pint? Well, it is £1.62. That is good value in my book for such an excellent result. This means a typical 500ml bottle would have been £1.43, or a 330ml bottle 94p. Which brings us to the overall ranking. Now this was wonderful. In terms of flavour, I gave it a 10, perfect. In terms of aroma, which is absolutely delicious, I gave it a 9.5, which was almost perfect, which gave us an overall 9.5 result for an absolutely delicious and enticing drink. But how does that rank compared to the others? Well, no surprises, it came in joint first place with the California Common. Again, another drink I enjoyed wonderfully earlier this year. I'm gonna have to top up. Look at that, far improved in terms of clarity. That's what we're looking for. Nice head, well done. Nice carbonation. That first bottle let me down. Look at the clarity on this one. This is much better. Cheers. We'd better get on with the lessons learned. Lesson number 1 is how low can we go? This was a test to see if a 10-litre batch was possible in the Digiboil. The answer is yes, it was, but only on a technicality. It was pretty tough to stir the mash given the low volume and little water available to stir it in. But you know, we got away with it. But 15 to 16 litres is probably my sweet spot for the Digiboil. Also, as a side note, 6 litres when it turned out this good was mortifying. Lesson number 2 is the strike temperature. Now for some reason Brewfather always seems to be about 2.5 degrees above the mash temperature, which I find to be far too high. For the last few homebrews I have simply moved it up by 1 degree, and that has been perfectly acceptable and has worked out really well for me on this particular device. Lesson number 3 is first wort hops. Now first wort hops are the addition of hops at the end of the mash out phase as you're bringing the temperature up to the boil. This increases the steeping time, improves the extraction of hop oils and results in a smoother bitterness, which I can say is what we have experienced in the final result. Lesson number 4 is the reuse of yeast. Now I am now addicted to yeast reuse, having finally got over that hurdle of being worried and nervous about doing this. I am now absolutely going to do it all the time, as we saw with this recipe as I harvested the yeast again. However, I was a little overeager, I do appreciate that, but do check out my video on yeast harvesting. Lesson number 5 is the ice spindle, now correctly configured, now working effectively. I love data. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I am really enjoying this device. Now it's not for everybody. It's a pretty cheap option though. Again, I've done a video on that too. I think this is a wonderful addition to my gearhead nature of just adding some extra equipment. However, that data is terrific, and it is the reason I decided to move to bottling earlier. Without that data, I would not have known it had reached that final gravity for 2 or 3 days. Lesson number 6 is about boil off rates. Now I have previously configured the lower power boil off rate to match up with the 500 watts I'm using to 1.6 litres per hour. That does seem to be working out about right. The only problem I had this time was just being able to see, once you added all of the extra equipment in, like the chiller, whether the boil was still happening, and I did just nip up the overall power just for the final few minutes, but that was fine. That was a pretty small change to the 30-minute boil. Lesson number 7, and I mentioned this at the beginning, is that stupidly high 96% brew house efficiency. That cannot be true. So my working hypothesis is, because that I am actually doing the reading from within the grain bed, I'm picking up a very sugar-rich end result. So I do need to figure out a slightly different approach to this. I would appreciate if anyone's watching any advice on this point. Lesson number 8 is the mash out power settings. Now get ready for a bit of craziness here, because at first I found it difficult to bring up the temperature to 75 degrees. So I increased the power, and then of course by increasing the power I overshot the 75 degrees for mash out. So it was lose-lose. This has led to me experimenting with some of the settings, as you can see with some of this information. So the original plan was nice and simple: switch on 500 watts, away you go. The reality though was somewhat different. I stayed on 500 watts before I got bored. That took me to about 68 degrees. It didn't move very much. I upped the power to 2400 watts to get me to 72 degrees, and I thought this is about the time to start powering down, which I did to 1900 watts and got to 75 degrees. Mash out started. Then I got to 76 degrees, mash out was now increasing. Then I dropped it to 500 watts and the temperature continued to go up to 78 degrees. Yes, there definitely needed to be a little bit more finessing in terms of those power settings when it comes to simply raising the temperature by 10 degrees. So next time for the cream ale, I have a new plan. We will see how that works out. Lesson number 9 is the yeast starter, and I ended up with 1 litre of yeast starter. Was that too much? Was that too little? Could I have split it down? I did go to split it down during the actual brew day itself, and then changed my mind and put the whole litre in. What was the right quantity of yeast when you create a yeast starter? Lesson number 10, ale fermentation, is more of a reminder to self. Really, we were ready within 7 days. Lesson number 11 refers to a hop stand, which we didn't have on this occasion, but I have recently watched a video where the power was kept on during the hop stand, so if you did drop below it, it would kick back in and keep it at temperature. I have always tried to just manage it with the cooling. One to remember for the future. Lesson number 12, our final lesson, is I need an on-off switch for cooling. That bending over and pulling out the plug, or trying to quickly, just doesn't work. So watch out for next time on the cream ale. I have a solution with a little help from Alexa. Thank you everybody for watching. I do appreciate it. If you have any comments, do drop us a line. In the meantime, happy homebrewing everybody. Please do like and subscribe. Cheers. Job done.